I often use these first two rules of mechanics. And the first rule of mechanics is never trust what you feel, especially in something as organic as running. You think you run a certain way, and then you look at the video and you have some distinctions, and, you're either appalled or quite pleased with what you see. And then the second rule of mechanics is if you want to create change, you need to exaggerate the movement.
The Triathlon Show 225. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Coach Bobby McGee. Bobby is a world-renowned running coach and a triathlon running coach who has more than 3 decades of experience in coaching elite and recreational runners and triathletes. Bobby is particularly knowledgeable in running form and what it takes to improve your running form and how to improve your running form based on the individual athlete in front of him. So we'll get into that a lot in this interview, as you can tell from the title. But in addition to running, Bobby is actually also a wealth of knowledge in sports psychology. So that's an aspect that I find very fascinating. And I was really happy to have a bit of a discussion towards the end on that topic as well. So just as last week's episode, this is another live recorded episode. So you might hear some of that in the recording, but it should be decent quality. We had a nice, quiet room to record in. So that was all good. Bobby was helping out and working with some athletes that he works with on an individual basis on the camp held by John O'Hall of Triathlon Canada for some of the Canadian athletes and his international athletes as well. So that's just to inform you about the context of this interview. So we'll get right into the episode after thanking our sponsors. First, we have Precision Hydration. Precision Hydration make electrolyte products that can be tailored to your individual sweat rate and sweat sodium content so that you can replace an adequate amount of sodium. Because if you do not do that, especially in longer and harder races, you run the risk of reduced performance and cramping. So Precision Hydration has developed, based on actual measured sweat and sweat sodium content data, they have developed a simple quiz that will give you a great estimate for what your actual sweat sodium content is without going to the trouble of actually finding a sweat test provider that can measure your sweat sodium content. So go to precisionhydration.com and click their free hydration plan tab, and that will take you to the test where you will just fill in your answers to 10 questions, and you will get your ballpark estimate for sweat rate and sweat sodium content and how to use that knowledge in your race strategy for hydration. You can also get 15% off your order on precisionhydration.com with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And big thanks to Roka. Roka have just launched a new wetsuit, the Maverick MX, which is a max buoyancy wetsuit designed to increase buoyancy while minimizing drag. And to give you a bit of a background on design, I've talked with Roka's team about this, and we discussed the wetsuit in depth, and I was really interested in hearing why they wanted to create a new wetsuit. And the reason is that in the past, the main reason to not simply design for maximum buoyancy was that if you do that, you were to lose shoulder flexibility. The arms subconstruction technology that Roka has invented provides a pattern-based, although not materials-based, solution to shoulder flexibility. So what Roka set out to ask themselves is how much buoyancy can they add now that they have a pattern-based solution to keep the shoulders free and flexible. And the result is the Maverick MX, which is their most buoyant suit ever, with very little impact to shoulder flexibility despite that added buoyancy. And the other good news is that it's very affordable at $450 or euros or 400 British pounds. You can find it on roka.com /TTS, and that is also where you'll get a 20% discount code for your order. Without any further ado, let's get into the interview with Bobby McGee. So I'm here for a live interview with Bobby McGee. Bobby, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Why don't you take a moment to introduce yourself and who you are and what you do?
Sounds good, Michael. Thanks. My primary position is with USA Triathlon at the moment. I'm a development coordinator for them, so I work with junior talent identification and development. And then, my background is I'm a South African by birth, and I basically went to university to study to be a coach. And so my stock in trade when I started off with the sports coaching was middle distance and long distance track running, and later graduated to more road running and marathon running. And then when I moved to the US, I started working more, sort of 96, around about that time. Started working more with elite triathletes and more in a supportive role. And then I also have my own business, Bobby McGee Endurance Sports, and I coach individual runners in that.
Great. And can you give some context for why you're here in Portugal, in the Algarve? What's your role here on this particular training camp?
Yeah, I work with, the previous Olympiad. I was working up to Rio. I was the high performance advisor for USA Triathlon, and I worked with a number of the athletes, both on an individual basis and then as team support leading up into Rio. And those relationships stayed in place. And at the moment, two of the athletes that I worked with in the previous quad, and that I in fact worked with long before that, are Kevin McDowell and Kirsten Casper. And I'm here to support them as they, work on their final lead up to, trying to make the team to Tokyo.
All right. So running is your primary focus area, I guess it's fair to say, and you also have put quite a bit of emphasis on running form, in particular how to get the most out of a runner by improving their running form, changing it if needed, fine-tuning it if needed. So let's start to talk about that. And how would you just describe good running form? What does it consist of?
It's a really good question. I think a better place to start is probably to look at the movement of running versus the other activities like swimming and biking or tennis or golf or whatever you want to call it. And I like to view running as primal or a first language. In other words, the way that you learned to run was very organic, very automatic, and it's almost more primal than walking, because it's the mode by which you get away from trouble and, go towards catching your food. So not a lot of people specialize in how to address mechanics. And so it became a fascination of mine many, many years ago, over and above the physiotherapy approaches, is that the way that individual run leads to them being injured. It took so many years for research to start showing that whatever has happened to that athlete from those formative years in running has led to them not running as effectively as they could. So in many ways, I don't teach people how to run. I help people get back to the best running that they are capable of.
So you're saying that basically what good running form looks like is very different from individual to individual, perhaps depending on their functional mobility and their body type and that sort of thing. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, it's good that you talk about, range of motion and functional mobility and stuff like that. So anthropometry plays a big role in that. And sadly in all endurance sports, as Tim Noakes was fond of saying, is if you want to be a good endurance athlete, you have to go back and re-choose your parents. And so running mechanics is like that. You have to work with what you've got. If you have somebody with a long torso and reasonably short legs, that your approach to them, would be more cadence-based, more power-based, whereas if you're working with somebody with a very natural out the back, long stride length, you want to just make sure that those things that are getting in the way from them being able to perform that way, that you teach them that. So, it definitely is not only what their build type is, but also how did they grow up? Did they grow up with intermittent high speed running, or did they grow up with continuous running, or did they grow up in an endurance sport where there was no loading on the lower limb? So you have to address things like bone density and actually the eccentric elastic loading nature of running, say, versus cycling or versus swimming.
So can we try to illustrate with a couple of examples of or case studies with athletes you worked with? So perhaps if you pick one elite athlete, you don't have to name it if you the athlete if you don't want to, and perhaps an age group athlete, just to give the listeners an idea of some typical, whether it's fine tuning or more bigger changes that you've made to these case study athletes' running form, and how that works, how you optimize based on whatever their background and body type, etc. is.
Yeah, I think you can look at to give you a specific example might be fair or unfair to certain athletes. So you look at an athlete that, say, predominantly seems to be way up on the midfoot, even on the forefoot when they're running, and determining whether that athlete, by virtue of their calf size or by virtue of their injury history, if that's a natural gait for them, or do they just have some tissue imbalance where, the gastrocs and the soleuses are short, and so they're ending up on their toes just because they can't put their heels down. And you can address it that way. But I'm generally looking at, things like symmetry, elastic return, foot strike. Mostly I'm looking at braking and posture. So those are the two that I would look at. So I would look at a runner straight away and say, okay, they don't have a mechanical advantage because they're running with a very low arched back or a very high chest, and their eye line is above the horizon. And so they're not able to maintain momentum as effectively as a Richard Murray type runner that is very far forward and has a very large back kick and has the range of motion and the capacity and the development over time to be able to sustain that. So, you're not looking at an ideal running form. You're looking at an individual and you're asking yourself, what is the best running form that individual can sustain?
So this might be an impossible question to answer, but if you're working with age groupers, is there such a thing as a typical age group running form that you see with people that have been in endurance sports for at least a few years? So they're like experienced endurance athletes, but not necessarily, Kona age group winners or anything like that, but reasonable age group athletes. Is there any norm there, or is it all across the board really when it comes to running form? And what would be some very typical changes that you might make to an age group athlete's running form?
Yeah, I do think that there are some norms, and again, I think muscle fiber type and sport background often plays a big role in that. Even if somebody has been in a sport for a couple of years and has figured out a way to run, that way that they figured out to run, if it's not a continuum from when they were very young, is likely to be quite contrived based on visual images of what they think they look like when they're running and what they think they should look like when they're running. And so it's actually so much easier. You get far greater gains working with A, age groupers, and then B, triathletes who have this intervention of the other sports that keeps impacting their running from a peripheral standpoint. So a typical thing would be helping them understand what an overstride is, so that it's too much stride in the front, and helping them realize, okay, their limitation might be extension in the rectus femoris, or inability to achieve extension without anteriorly tilting their pelvis. And so you can go through, the physiotherapy, massage, chiropractic approach where you help them create a level of an awareness to be able to do that stride. Another one that I use a lot lately is age group runners that rely on gravity to bring them down to the surface. and think that running is all about the power of getting off the surface, where it's completely opposite. So, I call them floaters or gliders. They get off the ground and then they come down crashing into the ground, and their vertical oscillation whilst they're on the ground is quite dramatic, and they become quite quad dominant runners in that way. And similarly, you get runners who are unable to extend out the back, and so they end up reaching in the front. They have this rearward leaning shank and are putting on the brakes. And those are quite quick fixes, because they sometimes are completely, they live in a place that, I never even thought about that. So you saw an athlete earlier today who had never even considered how he was running and what his capabilities were. You just do a small little intervention, that little realization, first determine whether it's an imbalance thing or a tissue thing or a tightness thing or a range of motion thing, but you just change the cueing, you just change the internal dialogue, and immediately the cadence comes up, the run becomes more mechanically efficient.
So that leads into a bit of a detour, I guess, but you mentioned when you were talking with this athlete the 2 laws of mechanics, and I thought they were really nice. So can you just repeat them here for the listeners' benefit?
Sure. So, when an endurance coach works with athletes, the mindset is often one of extreme patience. The changes that the central physiology requires to adapt really requires consistency and duration of effort and careful management of that. Whereas sometimes, if you're lucky, you can kind of have a chiropractic approach to running. But the thing is to imprint this in the athlete and give them the tools to be able to do that. So I often use these first 2 rules of mechanics. And the first rule of mechanics is never trust what you feel, especially in something as organic as running. You think you run a certain way, and then you look at the video and you have some distinctions, and, you're either appalled or quite pleased with what you see. And then the second rule of mechanics is, if you want to create change, you need to exaggerate the movement. You need to really overdo it, because sometimes an athlete can make a change that is so subtle that it's not kinematically visible. So in other words, you can't see it on film, but they already feel discomfort. But that process is too difficult for them to be able to go to the central point. They actually have to exaggerate the motion. And you see that in all sports. Swimming is an ideal example of that, because that's also a high repetition motion. Athlete makes a slight change that's not visible to the eye, feels dramatically different, and then you give him a different cue. No, I don't want you to put your arm, your hand in the water a centimeter to the right of your center line. I want you to feel like it's 8 or 9 or 10 centimeters to the right. And then you might get a centimeter if you're lucky.
What are some of the cues that you might use for, again, just pick a few normal examples, perhaps some of the ones that you mentioned earlier around just not being able to extend back and actually like reaching forward with the leg, or about the posture, just normal cues that you would use to help runners overcome some of the common mistakes in running form that they might be doing.
Yeah, I think a conversation like that needs to also go to a place of, how does the athlete self-instruct? So in sports psychology, we learn that in rote movements, in endurance movements, you don't want to think about how you're executing the movement early on. You want to make sure that that your thought content, that your internal dialogue is more mood orientated, smooth, strong, capable, ready, fit, well-paced, any of those things which are more mood-type words. So it points to the fact that when you're working with running mechanics, you're not trying to have the athlete do something that is completely alien to them. You're not teaching them a new movement. You're refining the movement pattern, that contralateral extensor cross reflex that we all have when we run. So, an example of an athlete that has, say, limited extension capabilities, would probably 60% of the time be a tight rectus femoris. Sometimes it's the SI that's stuck. Sometimes it's the psoas that's stuck. So that would be, a therapy approach with dynamic mobility work designed to extend. So things like leg swings and active quad release work. If somebody is floating into the ground, coming in and extending their heel, not gathering the ground, then you would use static drills like pop drills, where they would stand up against a wall with the 1 foot up, and they would drive that leg down and try and bounce it off the ground. Or they would do something like an A-skip, where the whole emphasis of the A-skip is driving the leg down to load the plantar fascia and the Achilles tendon and bounce forward. And the A-skip's a great place to teach posture as well, because if you do the A-skip with poor posture, you can either stay in one spot or go backwards. So they interrelated in that way.
Okay, so it sounds we're getting into an important question here, which is how do you actually change running form? And it sounds like, in some cases, therapy plays a part if you have some limitations in your muscles and your soft tissue. But in many cases, it's actually about doing, for example, drill work, and then that translating into the running rather than just thinking about a certain cue. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, at the moment in this camp, what's so good is I have a therapist working with me while I'm assessing the athlete, and physical therapists typically are looking at isolated joint motions, and they're not seeing the athlete perform dynamically. So I find that while dynamic mobility drills are absolutely essential before quality work, I'm finding that they become very useful after long runs. They become very useful after long rides. They become very useful partially after swimming to restore the running motion. So I've drifted a little bit off answering your question, but they show me what needs to be worked on. Is it a soft tissue thing? Is it a balance thing? Often it's a power thing that displays itself in poor balance. But sometimes it's like a really rote, direct fix. The athlete has habituated a movement, maybe because of an injury, or maybe because of something silly like carrying a phone or carrying a water bottle or something like that, has now habituated this new movement. There's an asymmetry, and now there's a period, a reasonably uncomfortable, painful period to restore that symmetry back. You often see it with track athletes that, if you have them do a stride with a blindfold on, they'll always go to the left. They're so used to going to the left. And when they start to understand and get this distinction, oh, wait a minute, I'm actually correcting to straighten up all the time, not knowing it, and it's just not mechanically efficient. I'm using a little, and, working the other way, running the opposite way around the track, that kind of thing, just addressing, the stability and the typical leg length discrepancies that arise from running around a left-hand turn all the time.
So getting into drills a little bit, you mentioned wall drills, A-skips, and generally dynamic warm-ups and dynamic work even after workouts. What are some other exercises or drills that you find are useful in certain scenarios for athletes? Yeah,
so because of the ipsilateral nature of swimming, I sometimes find that athletes get stuck with their upper body. And it's a thing that we work with all the time, and it's this concept of being disconnected. So they want their arms to be on rails. They don't realize that when the shoulders oscillate, that their stance width with their elbows, the points of their elbows, gets narrower. And so for them to understand the three-dimensional motions that they need to do, I invent drills. So one of my favorite drills to establish connection, both in terms of the torso with the pelvis, is something I call a Velcro drill. Whereas I have the athlete imagine they have Velcro on the middle of their forearm and Velcro right down the center line of the side of their chest. And they Velcro their arms with a little bit of hand sticking out the front and a little bit of elbow sticking out the back. And they run with their arms stuck to their sides until they feel the natural response of their shoulders to their hips. That, as I said earlier, the contralateral oscillation of that, so when the left hip goes forward, the right shoulder goes forward. Then you get them to loosen the Velcro mid-run, and their arms are on plane, and they are able to hold that and they can feel that. And then the visual part that I spoke about in the first two rules of mechanics that look so good is when they do that drill, I videotape them from the back. And when they see themselves running that way, they look very good, but they feel awful. But they do have that imprint in saying, wow, that looks compact, that looks economical, that looks so easy to do. And I even have the elite athletes literally do the Velcro run mid-race just to establish that connection again. They just stick their arms to their side for 3 or 4 steps, and then they let them go, and off they go again. So that's an example. Another example is a drill I do that's called dog bones, which is, having them stand on the spot and powerfully swing their elbows in a running motion. And what they realize is if they let their shoulders stay rigid, all right, that they lose balance. It's a very difficult activity to do. But if they realize that it's not a rotation, but a reach motion, and that the power move is backwards, that those hand weights play a gyroscopic role and their balance is returned and they feel the movement so much more effectively. And again, both of those are examples of exaggeration.
And when do you think is the best time to do various drills? And also on a related note, with the dynamic activation movements, do you prescribe them before essentially every run, or is it before harder runs only? And can you go into both of those things? Like when do you do drills, how often, and what about the dynamic activation?
All right. So with dynamic mobility drills and drills in general, I make sure that the athlete understands that those things play 3 roles. The first role is you trying to address a mechanical anomaly that they've got into. So you're trying to correct that and have them re-habituate what they were doing that was effective. The second reason is you do it as an activation activity. And sometimes it serves a mental role. It's just a comfortable ritualistic thing for them to do before competition or before training. Just gets them a little bit more intentional and a little bit more focused. And then the last thing that you would do, let's say you're doing harness work, that's pretty high load work. So you could do it for muscle endurance or power purposes. So it serves those 3 roles. So it depends when you're doing it. And so the important rule when it comes to doing drills is this realization that frequency makes improvements in function. So frequency creates habituation. And initially, a large part of the initial process, the athlete should do these as fresh as possible. After a while, you can start introducing doing these things when they're fatigued, so that they still learn to be able to do that under duress, when the hierarchy of fatigue is greater than the hierarchy of maintaining good form. But unlike the bike, where getting out of position has a high feedback rate to the athlete, and in the water, getting out of position, they can feel they're dragging, they can feel they're struggling. In the run, they have these postural changes while they're running, but they're not aware of it. And so it's important. We spoke earlier, you and I, about Nick Winkelman's book on cueing. It's important to provide them with cues, self-coaching cues, things like speaking to themselves in the second person, being their own coach, only looking at their form, through a checklist when they're fatigued, and only addressing things that are now no longer there. So back to the dynamic mobility drills, as I said, I normally just use them extensively before quality workouts, but I really like the idea of doing them after the bike, because people get very impaired. An example I always give people is when you tie your shoelaces before you go out the door for a long run, that is not a challenging activity. But for most athletes, when they come back in, to get down to the same distance to tie their shoes is not nearly as hard. And so it's not a bad idea to restore function before they get into the rest of their life. And then that's exaggerated off the bike. So they spend, just from a sheer time perspective, they spend so much more time in the saddle than they can spend running, that the biking can tend to blanket the running motion. And I think it's the AIS that's done some good research on pros and amateurs alike, with this realization that some people, a small percentage of the pros, literally cannot return to their running kinematics when they get off the bike. They have different kinematics. And so myself and a number of coaches are of the belief that if you do these drills enough, just like, swim to run when you're running into transition, you don't feel that thick upper body anymore and that bloated feeling when you get in the water and that top heavy feeling when you get out of the water. It's the same with drills. The more you do these drills, the more the central nervous system gets primed, probably myelinized as well, to switch from one motion to another motion and not impact your kinetics so badly. So in other words, the period of time from going from one sport to another is reduced, because we know everybody's kinematics are impaired when you first get off the bike.
And the one thing that, if we go back to the start of changing running form, how do you know when to do it? Obviously, if you're working with somebody like yourself, then you have a coach that can tell you, okay, so for you, it makes sense to do this and that change, perhaps, or perhaps you're good as you are. But for people that don't have that opportunity, is that the only way that to go and see somebody with real expertise in the area, or is there a way to self-assess in some way what changes they might need?
Yeah, I guess I have to start with a warning. Be careful of the infomercial approach to running mechanics. It is a very multifaceted approach, but you can literally look at photographs of yourself and you have a lot of runners who have just the slightest inkling, have watched something on YouTube and have watched how an elite runner runs and watched an expert analyzing how that individual runs. So they might know, oh, okay, simple things like I have a 2-beat foot strike. When my heel hits the ground, there's one sound. And then when my forefoot hits the ground, there's another sound. That's not a good thing. There's something up with my transition. People all have phones and the ability to view themselves running in slow motion. They can see when they start to bear weight, whether their shin is leaning backwards and they're putting on the brakes. So I think there definitely is that ability for people to start looking at that, and more physical therapists, with the popularity of triathlon, popularity of distance running on the roads. There's more and more physical therapists that have that skill set and are able to look at that and just say, look, we can improve that. What is probably less apparent is what are the most economical drills to do? And you spoke about when to do them. And as I said, those individuals can sacrifice 5 or 10 minutes of their run to go through these drills, and they'll get a lot more out of their run.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And with you mentioning that, people have smartphones and they can take a video of themselves running. I have used a couple of apps that I find really useful for just viewing running form in frame by frame. Huddle Technique and Coach's Eye are two that come to mind. So do you use anything like that out of curiosity, or any recommendations on that front, on the tech front, for how to get good footage and video of your running?
I do. I actually like Huddle Technique myself. So that's what I use. So, the simplest way that I do it is I just get the athlete to send me a couple of frames of them running, both fatigued and fresh, and at their, projected race pace, or the race pace that they want to run in. And it's so much easier to isolate the frame. It's just important to warn people, that there's no fix all. And that also sometimes when people videotape stuff, the frame density is not high enough. And for them to realize that, the rating is generally so much higher in running than it is in swimming, even in cycling. And it's difficult to get that exact start point. So, one of the start points that I use is full extension and look at the stride angle. So the angle between the front hamstring and the back quad, but also looking at that shin angle, but knowing exactly when to look at that, So how do you know that you first starting to bear weight, and then just bearing in mind, are you noticing a deflection on the opposite side of the pelvis and stuff like that? So it can, but there's definitely so many drills that you can do that do no harm. So you can go, okay, I'm going to do this drill. It's not a complicated drill. Even if it's not 100%, you're still going to get some benefit from it.
And if you are trying to implement a change, obviously this is going to probably vary hugely, but what would you say is a common time course for implementing a change, or just a range And also, is there a case of it will get worse before it gets better when it comes to your running form and things like economy even?
Yeah, it's interesting when we first spoke with the advent of power in running. I think one of the things that people are discovering and will discover is that the implementation of change is not as tedious as one would think, especially if you're making a gross change that was basically hurting you before, and you're now, for example, driving your foot down to the ground actually decreases the intensity of your foot strike. It improves your kind of aesthetics. So, in terms, it would be easy to test. I haven't tested it before, but what I do is have people go out on their regular runs, report back how often they needed to return to the new feel, and then we look at their overall performance. So we're looking at heart rate, or we're looking at power, and so on. And surprisingly, it is not as dramatic as you would think. And obviously, the better the athlete is, the harder it is for them to adapt to the new change, because until only recently, there was an understanding that these things don't work. But I think what is important to point out, you're not really trying to change the movement more than you're trying to change the kind of aesthetic set point. So you're saying your arm is ending up here, or your hand is ending up here because of this, So if you fix that from the start, it remains like that through the whole cycle, but you're not addressing the movement. You're addressing the start point, which makes it a lot easier. I think Jack Nicklaus was famous for saying, I don't worry too much about my swing. I know that if I get the club in the right place in the first place, it can only go one place, and that's the right place. So I try to think of it like that, is how can I find an image or a moment or a pose, as it were, where the athlete feels, okay, that feels to me like it should feel. When I do that, you say I'm in the right position, and that's how I'm going to set it up. So very often I will talk to even the elite athletes. When you arrive at a training venue and you start your warm-up run, how are you moving? Did you lean back and take a step? Or did you drop onto your drive line by dropping your chest? Did you take big steps and try and establish stride length first? Or did you try and establish rhythm first? And then you point to examples of elite athletes that are very successful runners. You say, look, they start off with very small, quick steps. They establish rhythm first. And then as they overcome momentum and as they recruit up, they start flowing, So using that kind of thing. And it is more of a holistic approach, you're focusing on one thing and you're going all the way up the chain. The athlete's got a sore peroneal tendon, and it's because on the opposite side, his arm is crossing across the front of his chest, and he's got a kinetic chain issue going on. You fix the arm, which is not in pain, and the ankle stabilizes out, So it does require more of that kind of gestalt approach,
And one final thing on the mechanics and running form side of things. Do you use things like strides, hill sprints, even hills in general are used quite often for running form purposes? Are those things that you incorporate and like to prescribe?
Yeah, I'm very leery of using something like hills where the athlete's hierarchy of what is important might interfere. So, you've spoken previously on a podcast about form runs, where you're running up the hill and you're trying to be as economical and as neat as possible. And the cue that I normally give the athletes that I work with is that there's a bunch of gymnastic judges sitting along the side of the hill, and they're giving you style points. They don't care how fast you're going, how much power you're putting out, and so on. So if that's the purpose, I think that's a good idea. But if you have a situation where the athlete's trying to, achieve a VO2 max workout or a lactate threshold workout on the hills, then that's different. But using hills to extend an athlete's stride, to increase their drive down, things like that, it's far more effective on hills than, say, on a treadmill.
And with that, let's move on to some more general topics, still around running. primarily. And the first thing that I'm interested in hearing are your thoughts on run volume. And let's keep the focus here on run volume specifically for triathletes.
Yeah, when it comes to long course, and I know that a lot of your listeners are interested in that, when it comes to long course, I often feel that very few long course age group athletes can actually get to real run training. They just run. All right. But they're very scientific about their approach to the bike. They're very scientific about the approach to the swim. And then the run is kind of like an afterthought because the nature of the beast is they just don't have the capability or the time to actually train that up as well. And then I always go from the first principle is that, most of them will achieve success rates on the bike beyond what they should be doing in the race. So I have a simple little rule of thumb that I say, if you're putting out optimal power on the bike, you should be able to continue putting that power out for the duration that you expect to run. And otherwise the blame keeps repeatedly being placed on the run ability when it's nothing to do with the run ability. They're either overbiked or they're not strong enough on the bike or not conditioned enough on the bike to sustain the output that they had. So, if I had a buck for every guy who predicted his swim time perfectly and his bike time perfectly and was 20 minutes off on his marathon time, I'd be a wealthy man. So I do think that there's not enough simulation work done. I literally think that, anybody that's, doing Ironman in the 12 plus range would probably be better off doing really challenging hikes rather than long runs. And without a question of doubt that, being able to sustain a manageable pace, both in terms of their nutritional and metabolic capabilities, that the way to go is to, do the run walk methodology. It's just so much easier to pace. It's so much easier to sustain a pace that you're capable of.
Is that something that you would advise even for those that are running the Ironman marathon, let's say coming close to 3 hours?
It's a very good question, and some part of that question is answered by the ego of the individual. But basically, the simple rule of thumb is if you could go faster walk running, well, then walk run, and that's the ego conversation. I remember working for a long time with Gordo Byrne, and twice he used the run walk method to run 1:15 off the bike in a half Ironman. So it's definitely doable, but it's a question of performance. What works for you? If you're a bigger individual that can sustain a high pace quite comfortably and your stride variability at a slightly higher pace is comfortable for you, and you can do that 9:1 or you can do that 6:1 or something like that, and your overall result and your ability to sustain that over the course of the marathon or the half marathon is greater because of that, then do that. But if you're a smaller individual that is highly mechanically efficient, you would just be losing time. You might as well just run the whole way.
So I'm going to come back to the question about running volume a bit and to make sure that we get it clear. So were you saying that you think that most runners are not running enough, that their volume is insufficient?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it's better to get to the start line than it is to attempt to do the kind of run training that is high risk and is going to have you injured. So in other words, for an Ironman athlete to try and go out and do, 16 or 18 kilometer, tempo run or something like that. I'm saying that, sure, you need to go out there and run at the race pace that you intend to run at off the bike under good conditions, but fractionalize the hell out of it, so that you are able to sustain that. So, run volume is such an individualized conversation. There's, just to generalize, the bigger guys are so much better off doing a lot of power and a lot of strength work that has them able to stay on their legs with the output that they have. And, the smaller athletes that can metabolize that amount of running and not impact the quality running that they, the quality training on the bike or in the water or in the run that they need, can do a little bit more volume. But to have the volume match up to the race distance is a myth. Because you've got a 119-pound male running 140 kilometers a week, all right? And it feels to that individual from a physiological cost benefit and a neuromuscular cost benefit like he's running, 50 kilometers a week, whereas, the 80 or the 75 kilogram guy, he's not going to get to that mileage anyway, and that mileage is going to be slowly but surely just break him down. It's not going to serve the purposes you need. So it's highly individualized. I remember when I first started with triathlon, looking at these numbers saying the average ITU athlete runs 125 kilometers a week if it's a male and, 110 kilometers a week if it's a female. But it's just a complete myth. Some athletes can run, some of the women can run, around about 33 minutes off the bike on 30 kilometers a week, because they took care of the bike and their best running is available.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. So what would you say is the range of run volume that your elite ITU athletes are doing now, from the low end of things to the high end of things?
In those years with Gwen, she was getting away with very, very little, very little mileage, somewhere around about 50 kilometers a week. And I very seldom see an elite athlete doing more consistently over a period of 6+ weeks, doing more than 60 miles or 100K a week. The sweet spot of if there is such a thing as a sweet spot, would probably be in the 55 to maybe 80 kilometers a week on some periods of time, depending on what phase they are in and what they're working on.
Perfect. And let's discuss intensity and quality runs, if you want to call them that. How do you incorporate them in training? What do you think is the right amount? When do you think they should be done? And what type of intensity do you have a preference for, if any?
I would probably say my initial thought would be do the least amount of work to meet the demands of competition. So we were speaking earlier about this concept of placing an athlete on a continuum from a high octane athlete to a diesel athlete. And that to me sometimes impacts the taper as well. So you're looking at an athlete that's more of a diesel. They lose form if they change their training pattern or they cut back too dramatically. But from my perspective, where I sit in terms of the coach-athlete relationship, I'm the advisor to the coach. So the things that I'm looking at are the neuromuscular connection, the coupling to the velocity demands of the race. So if this athlete on the left-hand side can achieve the demands of competition and only do tempo-type running, then I would say, well, why would you go any faster than that? And then, some of the other athletes might need a little bit more of the threshold. And sometimes I feel that, you always have to bear in mind that part of that is also psycho-emotional, that they need that amount of intensity. So some athletes might need 8 400s for them to believe they can run X time for 5K off the bike. And other athletes feel, no, they need 6 times a mile, and they both end up at the same position. But I like to work, when I'm viewing it from a distance and I'm trying to give the coach, a little bit of a different perspective on what the coach is doing. I like to view it as 7 areas of work, and so I've got, the first 2 intensity factors, and I kind of like to almost drop out the second intensity factor. If the athlete is getting what they need through going super easy, then that's fine, because that's a great place for them to learn gait and to learn mechanical economics as well. And then looking at tempo and as the poor man's LT, if we can get away with tempo, then I think that's the way to go. If you look at it classically, the threshold is the money intensity to go at. And if you want to raise that up a little bit, just throwing in some VO2 max towards the end of that phase, but importantly coming back to the LT again. But then I'm also, from my middle distance background, I'm fascinated by the super VO2 max stuff, the speed endurance stuff, the 30-second work with the maximum recovery. I like that stuff a lot. I like to assess strides, to look at the athlete's stride capacity. I don't have a thought that there's any kind of zones other than maybe tempo. Everything else is governed by the purpose of the workout. And then with triathletes, you can get so much more eclectic. You can do a little bit of each one. Sometimes within the same workout, you can do, who was it? Pat Clasey, the Australian coach, had what he called complex training, and just do little bits of everything all the time.
So for the elite athletes, how many days per week might they be running, and how many days per week might they be doing some more intense running, so tempo or above?
There's definitely no single answer to that one. Very, very different. So it's sometimes, we have a number of athletes that come from running backgrounds, and excuse me, and we find it important for these athletes, even the morning of the race, to do a swim workout. Now, the opposite is true too. If you're not a natural runner, you want quite a lot of frequency. You want to be able to sustain your rhythm and find your rhythm very easily. So they would run, they might be running 9 times a week or 8 times a week, but they, probably not less than 4 or 5 times a week. But again, it's very athlete dependent. And in terms of that quality work as well, I go from the standpoint as we spoke about, I'd rather have an athlete be undercooked and get to the start line than to be even slightly overcooked and be over the top. So those quality workouts would all depend on the context, especially of the bike, because if you look at it from an energy system perspective, a lot of times you can get away with running just returning to the neuromuscular establishment of the velocity.
And how do you prescribe run workouts? Do you prefer, or do you work with a combination of pace, heart rate, power, RPE? Can you explain that process?
Yeah, I would have to go back to what I do currently with runners and what I used to do with runners, when we were working on running a specific time or winning a specific championship, things like that, because, I have not had a lot of experience of prescribing that directly to triathletes. I would speak to the coach and he might get an idea. She might feel, okay, that's a good idea. And I could incorporate that in a certain manner. But from my own perspective, rephrase that for me so I can tell you from a runner's perspective.
Do you prefer to prescribe workouts, like if you're writing a training plan for a runner that you coach, or even for yourself, to work on heart rate or pace or power or RPE or a combination? Got you.
The old man in me spaced that. So again, it's what's available. What is the athlete used to? I am a big fan of power at the moment. So I really like what seems to be possible from power. There's obviously a couple of little things to be worked out. But I really like the fact that it's closer to a fixed number, despite surface, despite conditions, despite, the athlete's mental, emotional status. So I like power a lot. I have no problem working with heart rate, but I do feel that its limitations are at the bottom end, that it can serve as a ceiling, but always bearing in mind the athlete's training status. And then it's good feedback as to whether the coach or myself as the coach has got the workout right. But I don't really like the idea of guiding a workout other than, as I said earlier, maybe tempo, but I don't like the idea of guiding workouts with heart rate, from VO2 max all the way down to the bottom.
And let's shift gears a little bit and talk about sports psychology, which is another area that you've worked in for a long time. And let's start with, what do you think are the most important things that athletes can and should do to make sure that they're on top of their mental game?
Yeah, mindfulness. We spoke about it. So I think each athlete has a style of achieving a performance. the whole concept of positive thinking is, of late being turned on its head, because we know a lot of these great athletes are very, very negative thinkers, and they go out and they perform at very, very high levels. But I think an increased awareness of what is distracting you and what is keeping you away from your intentional focus, and what to do with that, just moving towards the old saw of you are not your thoughts, and paying attention which thoughts you should be listening to and which thoughts you should not be listening to. So, different styles, some athletes are really good at visualizing. Some athletes, have worked well on a sort of audible mindset. But I think just increasing an understanding of you are already performing. What you are doing might be something you think is holding you back. Let's look at that. I've had situations where an athlete's parents would come to me, or an athlete's friends would come to me and saying, you really got to help this athlete. They get really nervous. They're bouncing off the walls before races. They're impossible to control, et cetera, et cetera. But the athlete's performing really, really well. And so, when the athlete comes to me with that, I say to him, look, it's not your problem. It's their problem. Your process is working just fine because you're performing. So I think that just moving away from the fact that any kind of mental skills work is to enhance performance, is not to fix anything. And for, the average coach to realize that their job is not that of psychologist. Their job is that of motivator, of, being the logical influence. And then I think part of this drive with mindfulness is for the athlete to continually increase their ability to be objective about their process, to observe themselves under pressure and give themselves that realization that they are in control of the situation, or they are in control of what they can control.
So you said that there is any intervention that you do on the sports psychology side is not to fix anything, it's to enhance performance. That being said, are there any things that you see that might hold athletes back in terms of their performance on the mental side of things, like any common traps that athletes fall into with their psychology and their mental state?
Yeah, I think I've alluded to it, but I think it's cognizance, or no, not cognizance, it's giving in to their level of thinking, So, to make a terrible generalization, I think some male age group athletes source the information which tells them what they're capable of incorrectly. They filter it through ego. And so they set themselves up for failure that way. And sometimes the opposite is true as well. Individuals want to take pressure off themselves, so they set themselves up for a much lower level of performance than they're capable of. But if you go from the general understanding that the main source of anxiety in a healthy athlete is their fear of not achieving a performance that they believe they are capable of, I think that that's the main source of anxiety. So if they look at that, then the thing they need to look at is how did they create this expectation? Where does it come from? So if they are referring to numbers and workouts that they have done that have no relevance to the performance, and they're gaining their expectations from that, then they're setting themselves up to fail as well. So those 4 steps with internal dialogue. What are you thinking? Is it helping you? If it's not helping you, what would be a better process in terms of your intentional focus? And then lastly, of course, habituate it so that when the storm winds of competition blow, that those couple of sheets that you've recently written don't get blown off the top of the pile and you get the old crap back.
How important do you think motivation is? And what do you do? Because motivation will wane at some point, not necessarily continuously, but you'll have days when you are less motivated. How do you make sure that you still do the work required on those days? I find this an interesting topic with the sort of balance between motivation and setting up routines and habits that can pull the load for when motivation isn't really there. So what's your thoughts on that?
I have to admit to being less proficient at that process, I had an early mentor coach say to me, you can activate athletes, you can't motivate them. Motivation is up to them. But when you work with athletes that I'm privileged to work with at the level that they work at, if there's any kind of doubt about what it is they want to achieve and what it takes, we have bigger problems, But for an athlete that, is an age group athlete and, sometimes motivation wanes, the obvious thing is to go back to, what is the long-term desire? As endurance athletes, all of us are a sick bunch of puppies, right? We into delayed gratification. And so you just need to realign with that gratification. And those athletes come to that point where, they're no longer willing to do that. That's sometimes the turning point. So I remember having a conversation back with a triathlon friend of mine. We were doing that and he said, how do you so comfortably just, no matter what kind of shape you're in, you're always running, under 40 minutes for 10K off the bike. How do you do that? And I go, well, I know what my capability is and I'm very happy that with the amount of training I'm able to do on top of my coaching and everything else, that I can do that. And I also know that if I employ a physiotherapist and I train twice as hard and I do all this sort of stuff, I'm not going to go a hell of a lot faster. And that amount that I do go faster is not going to make me a pro anyway. So, so I think achieving that balance. And then I think with, growing up in South Africa where the Comrades Marathon is the thing, you can be a sub 4 minute miler, but if you haven't run the Comrades Marathon, you're not really a runner, So growing up with that mindset that the training plays some part of how I define myself and I enjoy that process, and then the races normally come out of that. So I think the establishment of attitude and having somebody in your life who can make you aware of, listen, you're going at it too hard from a intensity of focus standpoint. You're just not going to get there. You're just going to lose the desire to do that. Just have somebody who is far enough removed from the conversation that they can continually just ground you in reality. Listen, you're a dad. You got 2 kids. You can't be out there training 30 hours a week. Josiah Tungwani, who won the marathon in the Olympics, we were at an altitude training camp in Sabi, and they just done a 30K run, kind of like a tempo effort. And I put the bike down at the side of the building and my legs were pretty wobbly from riding a mountain bike up at altitude over those hills. And I went inside, grabbed my running shoes, came back out, and Josiah said to me, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm just going to go for a run. And he said, Bobby, how fast do you run for 10K? And I said, about 34 minutes. And he said, you know what, Bobby, how long have you been running? I said, I've been running since 1968. He says, you can stop now. You're not going to get good. So that kind of mentality, just lends perspective to what you're doing,
Yeah, that's we could go very deep on that, but I think like some important points that you touched on there is like having creating an identity that is aligned with your goals and your life. That's a really good starting point at least for how to achieve long-term success without sacrificing other parts of your life. A final couple of questions. Do you see anything out there, whether it's training, equipment, recovery, nutrition, or in the academic field, that you think is overhyped or a fad?
It's a good question, and I'm not the kind of guy that goes out and poo-poo stuff. But time always is a great leveler. But I do find that from a mental perspective, people become too dependent on extrinsic devices. And we spoke earlier about RPE, and I didn't answer about RPE specifically. But I feel that people incorrectly recalibrate their RPE based on their devices. And so I think that some part of running, leaving the watch at home, or taping the watch over so your coach can get the data, but you don't know what you're doing while you're doing it, and really learning to viscerally experience your training and get back in touch with what that takes to be able to get the best out of yourself. So, I think the whole concept of doing your training so that you can put it on Strava as a primary objective, or doing is maybe not as effective for you in the long term. I think you need to be a bit of a Zen master. You need to be a little bit engrossed in your own process. And another thing that I don't like is normalized data from elite athletes, because I think that puts age groupers off. It gives them, it dings their self-worth so badly. What you're trying to do through your training is maybe improve your functional threshold power, and then you will perform better. But being all sheepish about it because your functional threshold power is, 100 watts less than the next guy's is not useful, is not useful. So I think that this over-reliance on extrinsic things might be a peeve of mine.
And overall, whether it's running or just more generally in endurance training, do you think, what are some of the most common mistakes that you would advise athletes not to make, that you see them making?
In triathlon, it's quite simple. They run too hard when they run because they feel they're running less. Okay, I've now come from running to triathlon, and so I can't run as much as I used to run. So when I do run, I'm going to run a little harder. I think that's a common mistake. I think another common mistake is expecting your progression rates on the run to match your progression rates on the bike. Expecting your run to get better that as quickly as it's possible to get better on the bike.
And final question before the rapid fire questions. Do you have some final piece of advice for age group triathletes?
Yeah, it's difficult. Make it more personal. Make it more intensely personal. I think that we also spoke earlier about the whole concept of FOMO. Race a couple of local races or a bunch of local races and get into those year after year, rather than always putting all of your effort and all your eggs into, a destination race that's going to be a crapshoot at best anyway to get the best out of you. So I think when I first came to the US, one of the things that I realized was there was a lot of people that pull their running shoes out of the cupboard and train for 6 weeks for one event every year. I don't think that that's as satisfying as being a lifestyle athlete, you're being a lifetime runner or whatever the case might be. So I think that would be my advice is that even if you're starting at 40 or 50 or 60, see it as something that will keep giving back to you if you play sensibly.
All right, great. And finally, for the rapid fire questions, which are just one sentence answers. So this is a big challenge, but I'm sure you'll be up for it. The first one is, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to triathlon or running or endurance sports?
Yeah, that triathlon show is not bad. That's not bad at all. I actually enjoy it. I'm more a current kind of books person. So I'm currently reading a book, it's a slightly older book, called What Makes Olga Run, about super seniors in sports. And I just find it's a rich source. So I'm enjoying that at the moment.
And what's a personal habit that's helped you achieve success?
I think the realization every single day that the athletes are my teachers. I get far more bang for my buck from them than I think they get from me.
And finally, what do you wish you had known or done differently at some point in your career?
That partying and being out with the gang didn't get me as far as I thought I could have got in sport.
All right. Thank you so much, Bobby. This has been a really fun talk, and I learned a lot, and I'm sure the listeners will as well. So we wish you all the best with the upcoming season and all the way up to Tokyo.
Thanks so much, Michael.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview, and I just want to say that the opportunity to do these kinds of live interviews with the absolute best of the best in coaching is absolutely fantastic. The week before this one, you heard Johnny Hall, and the week before that it was Arild Tveiten of the Norwegian triathlon team. So it's been fantastic to be able to meet these people over the last few weeks. And I also think that it really helps me conduct better interviews when there's more context. I've already met the person. I've been looking at what they're doing in training with their athletes. We've been discussing, talking shop before actually doing the interview. It just helps you go down some discussion trails that you might not have seen otherwise. So hopefully these kinds of coaches and their squads keep choosing Portugal as a training camp destination in the future, so we can get more of these. I've absolutely loved the opportunity to get to do these interviews, and thank you again to all the coaches mentioned for having me spend some time with them. You can find the show notes as usual for this episode on thattriathlonshow.com. And I'll link to quite a number of related episodes on running form there. And they will also be linked to in the podcast episode description in your podcast app. So if you want to learn more about running form, we've had a few of those, and there's more to dig into. It's been a while since I've asked, so I'll take the opportunity now to do so. If you enjoy the podcast and are a long-time listener, please take a moment to leave a rating and a review. You can check out scientifictriathlon.com/rate to get instructions for how to rate the podcast if you don't know quite how to do it. And that really helps the podcast. It goes a long way to helping new people find it, which at the end of the day is what makes it a worthwhile endeavor to spend the time that I do on producing the podcast. If you're interested in training plans, coaching, or customized plans, go and check out scientifictriathlon.com, which is newly updated, a fresh look and feel to it. So I hope that you enjoy that. I think it's a big improvement on what it looked like before, and hopefully it's not just visually, but also content-wise and information-wise. You'll find what you're looking for much easier now than before. Big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Take their free online sweat test to get a personalized hydration strategy, and get 15% off your order with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And big thanks to Roka. Check out their new Max Buoyancy Wetsuit, the Maverick MX, and get 20% off your order, whether it's the new Maverick MX or anything else that you might be interested in, by getting a promo code on roka.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.